Greek, Roman, and American civilizations. Greek civilization. The Greeks came from the north to the region of the Aegean Sea. These tribals, who were mainly shepherds, came in search of grasslands. Every group which came in this manner had a distinctive name: the Achaeans, the Ionians, and the Dorians. These people called themselves Hellenes or the Greeks.
Western civilization was nurtured and shaped 2,500 years ago in a small Greek state called Attica and its capital city, Athens. Yet in the early part of the 5th century BC, Athens nearly disappeared. The Acropolis, one of the most famous places in the world, was in ancient times the political and religious center of the city, its very heart. But in 480 BC, the Acropolis was burnt to the ground. The brave warriors of Athens had been overwhelmed by an invading army of 1 million Persians under the command of the dreaded Xerxes I, the great king of Persia. It seemed as if the city of Athens was dead. And yet, in the next 50 years, Athens emerged as the cultural capital of the entire Greek world, the cradle of current Western scientific and humanistic thought. The Acropolis of Athens was rebuilt in such a grand manner that it contained some of the finest temples and monuments in the world, like the awe-inspiring Parthenon. How did Athens rise like a phoenix from the ashes to become one of the greatest cities in history? And who were the leaders, architects, and artists that gave this city its special aura, virtually unmatched to this day? In 460 BC, after the Persians left Athens, a leader emerged who would enable the city to reach cultural and militaristic heights. His name was Pericles, and he is credited not only with major democratic reforms, but in rebuilding a powerful army and creating some of the greatest monuments of all time. Under Pericles' 30-year rule, the Acropolis the Persians destroyed was rebuilt in a glorious manner. Its principal building was the great Parthenon, but the hill was filled with dozens of smaller temples, each a masterpiece of design and execution. Pericles led the city through a golden age, which would make the name of Athens immortal. This was the era of artists, like the sculptor Phidias, the time when philosophers like Socrates and Plato sought eternal truths. This was when Sophocles and Euripides created Western drama. The foundations were laid for almost every aspect of modern Western civilization, even sport. Though Pericles succumbed to a deadly plague which decimated a quarter of the Athenian population, his accomplishments live on. Athens was the pinnacle of a dynamic which had been building for thousands of years. Greece is a land of contrasting, often spectacular landscapes. The ancient Greeks believed its woods and waters were populated by gods and goddesses and other supernatural creatures of every kind. In fact, the land was inhabited by a surprising range of very real creatures. The first people who came here arrived nearly 2,000 years before Christ, at the beginning of the Bronze Age. They belonged to a branch of the great Indo-European stock that migrated from the vast plains stretching from Europe to Asia. The earliest Greeks were tribes of warriors who spoke the same language but fought incessantly, struggling for possession of the richest and most fertile land. The first settlements were primitive rural communities. Then, between 1500 and 1200 BC, there was a general population boom. Magnificent palaces arose. They were an appropriate setting for mythical and legendary stories like those from the poet Homer, and adventure yarns like the voyage of the Argonauts and the trials of Pericles. Many of these stories are more fiction than fact, but one was thought to be real, Homer's epic tale, the Iliad, which told of the war of the Greeks against Troy. Troy was the city that fell to a horse filled with Greek warriors. But was there ever really such a city? For thousands of years, Troy and the Trojan War were thought to be only a myth. Then, beginning in 1870, Heinrich Schliemann, an amateur German archaeologist, began to unearth the ruins of Troy. The city had indeed been destroyed by a great coalition formed by the major city-states of continental Greece. It was a rare coalition. The ancient Greek city-states were usually in a constant state of war with each other. By the 5th century BC, there were about 4.5 million Greeks. It was at this time that Athens emerged as the most famous of the city-states. Athens still lives and thrives today. The modern city surrounds the Acropolis and the remains of the ancient city, showing thousands of years of continuous human habitation. Packed with a population of about 5 million people, it is often chaotic and polluted. Still, it is a living link to a vanished ancient world. In many places, the different periods the city has passed through are stacked one upon the other. But always, soaring majestically above the teeming city, was the eternal Parthenon and the other buildings of the Acropolis. The word Acropolis means the high part of a city, and in fact almost every city in ancient Greece had an Acropolis. Indeed, almost every city began as a settlement atop such a hill. Such sites were natural forts, protection against marauding beasts and enemy armies. Even as the ancient city grew and spread, the Acropolis was where the most important people lived. The Acropolis was where philosophy was debated and government conducted. Most significantly, the Acropolis was where gods and goddesses were worshipped in mysterious sacred rites. In the Mycenaean period, around 1200 BC, the original huts were replaced by fortifications, which later legends said were built by mythical giants. In 450 BC, the Acropolis took on the architectural appearance that established it as the center of Greek culture. The magnificence of the Acropolis remained intact even after the decline of Athens following its defeat by Sparta. Later, in the 2nd century AD, the Romans added new walls and buildings, like the spectacular theater of Herodes Atticus. During Pericles' lifetime, Athens was at the height of its splendor. Yet even as great political and cultural events were unfolding, citizens could lead a comfortable, enjoyable daily life. Families thrived and people lived together in a period of relative bliss and peace. The Athenians, like all ancient Greeks, were a pious people. They believed in the power of the gods to help them or harm them, so religious festivals were held throughout the year. The head of a family would make periodic sacrifices to the gods. There were also special offerings made for particular occasions, as when a family member had fallen ill or was about to begin a dangerous journey. The regular festivals climaxed every 4 years with a great procession to the Acropolis. This was the Pan-Athenia, honoring Athena, the city's protector. All residents, no matter what their rank or occupation, would have been part of the joyous procession.
Alexander. He was the king of Macedonia in Greece. In his short-lived life, he set out to conquer the world. He was successful in building a huge empire. He defeated the Persian army and advanced towards India. Aristotle, one of the greatest scholars of Greece, was his teacher. And after fighting on the Indian borders while on his return to Greece, Alexander died at Babylonia in 323 BC. Olympic Games. The Olympic Games began in Greece in 776 BC. The games, which were held once every 4 years, were also used for measurement of time. They used to be arranged in Olympia in Flis area as a part of the Olympic festival. This festival was celebrated in honor of the peace pact between Flis and Pisa city-states. In the beginning, there were only running races, and this race over 200 meters was called stadium. Thus, the term of measurement of distance was stadia, and an olive branch used to be placed on the head of the winner in the race. The Olympic Games were held for more than 1,000 years. They came to an end when the Christian emperor of Byzantine, Theodosius, banned them in the 4th century AD. The Olympic Games were revived in the 19th century under the initiative of France. The first Summer Games in the modern age were staged in 1896 and the Winter Games in 1924. Even today, Olympic Games are conducted once in 4 years. Socrates was the philosopher who taught the Western world to think logically. Socrates was renowned for the intellectualism and rationality. He gave a philosophical basis for early Greek thought. He believed in political, social justice, morality, religion, patriotism, democracy, humanity, and ethics. His life was a struggle of suffering and adventure. His intellectualism was mainly ethical, that is, knowledge is virtue and virtue is knowledge. This was the foundation of Socratic thought. He did not develop his philosophical thought within 4 walls. He used to carry on his intellectual exercise in the form of questions and answers with strangers in crowded areas of marketplaces, shops, and streets. Plato. He is one of the famous philosophers of Greece. He was a disciple of Socrates and advocated ideas of social justice and ethics, among others. He was the architect of the idea of ideal republic. He was disturbed by the life around him when the city of Athens was in danger. In order to avoid social and political disintegration, he advocated ethics, philosophy, and education with respect to society and the nation. He was a staunch supporter of education and started a school named the Academy in Athens, and this became famous as the first university of Europe. As a Greek thinker, Aristotle is as important as Plato in Western philosophy. He was Plato's pupil. Socrates and Plato had a deep influence on his thoughts. Aristotle is considered the father of political science. As he was a tutor and an admirer of Alexander, a few people, being prejudicial, opposed him. Enemies increased in number, and faced with no alternative, Aristotle committed suicide by consuming poison. Roman civilization. We can see the relics of ancient Roman civilization in present-day Italy. The original inhabitants of Italy were the people of North Africa, Spain, and France. They migrated to Italy around 4,000 years ago, and after some time, the Greeks and Etruscans came and settled here. The Italians are the descendants of these people, and the Italians learned the language, religious belief, and art from the Greeks. Rome was under the rule of a monarchy, and the Romans had assembly and a senate as two political advisory institutions. There were two classes in the Roman society, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the elite in society. They were landowners and formed the upper class. It is they who controlled the senate. The plebeians were the common people, and they were the ordinary workers, small landowners, artisans, small traders, and soldiers. Their rights were limited, and they were meant to paying taxes and to undergo punishment. The decisions taken by the council and the senate regarding the plebeians could be rejected by the tribunes. Gladiator. Thus, wrestlers of ancient Rome were called gladiators. There were both expert and amateur wrestlers among them. The fights were organized to entertain the civilized spectators. And these fights, which were fought between human beings and sometimes between human beings and animals, ended in gruesome death of the participants. The place where the combat between the gladiators were fought were called amphitheater and colosseum. Criminals, slaves, and prisoners of war who had lost their citizenship rights were taken as gladiators. Gladiators, on acquiring fame and wealth, were sometimes given freedom, and recently a film titled Gladiator has become famous worldwide. Each culture is responsible for the development of its language. The Roman reign was responsible for the development of the Latin language and literature. Rome also gave rise to distinct architecture. The Pantheon is a temple, whereas the Colosseum is an auditorium. Roman sculpture has been inspired by the Greeks and is full of life. On the account of the birth of Jesus Christ and the religion that he preached, Rome acquired prominence. American civilizations. Maya, Aztec, and Inca are the ancient Columbian civilizations of America. They represent the culture of Indian Aborigines of America. The countries of medieval Europe discovered new continents in their attempts to find out a new sea route to India. America and Australia, thus discovered, were misunderstood as India, and their inhabitants were called Indians. Thus, the Aborigines of America and Australia came to be called Indians. The ancient Columbian civilizations of America are distinct and special, like the civilizations of the Old World, like the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian, and the Chinese civilizations. We can see states, kingdoms, amazing monuments, cities, art, metallurgy, and the practice of writing in the civilizations of the New World too. Maya civilization. The American Indian Aborigines of Yucatan area of Mexico are called the Mayas. Their language is called Yuctec. Physically, the Mayas were short, brown complexioned, long haired, and generally round headed people. The Mayas were the most advanced among the ancient American Indians. The ruins of cities built of stone have been obtained in the Yucatan of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. This civilization rose to its cultural height around 1700 years ago, and their earliest cities were built around 320 AD. We see the dissolution of Mayan culture with the attack of Spain from 1527 to 1546 under the leadership of Cortes. A few descendants of Mayan Indians who survived these attacks can be seen even today in the northern areas of Yucatan and Guatemala. The life of the Mayas. The settlements of the Mayas included huge ceremonial centers. These have been called cities, but they were not inhabited by people. These areas were utilized for religious ceremonies, markets, courts, and city administration centers. People lived in villages around these areas. Except during the period of markets and religious celebrations, these ceremonial centers would be deserted at all times. Around a large site named Tikal pyramids, palaces, and courtyards have been found all around, stretching 1 square mile. The ordinary Mayas lived in huts on the outskirts of their ceremonial centers. There used to be maize fields all around. The farmers grew maize and yam among others. The labor of innumerable peasants were utilized here to construct huge houses. The Aztecs. Texcoco is a lake in Mexico. The Aztecs built their city on an island in this lake. They are called Tenoch, a name derived from their legendary ancestor Tenoch. Their city was called Tenochtitlan, the stone rising in the water. The city has also been called Mexica, and its inhabitants were also known by the same name. Their language was Nahua. Even today, there are people who speak Nahua in Mexico. The best of the architectural and sculpture representations are found on their buildings. Huge temples were decorated with carvings, and they have recorded historical and religious events using symbols and numbers through hieroglyphic writing. They had learned the use of the calendar from the Mayas, and their almanac gave the dates of festival and also the list of gods influencing events periodically. The Aztecs used their wealth and power to make their life luxurious in the capital. The king lived in a magnificent palace, and the nobles and innumerable slaves were under him. There were beautiful gardens and zoos near the palace. Roads, bridges, and canals led to the city. Provision was made for drinking water too. Trade connected Tenochtitlan with far-off places of the empire. Soldiers gave protection to the traders. Since there were no animals to carry loads, manual laborers were employed as beasts of burden to carry them. They used boats to sail in the canals while bringing the harvest from nearby farms. Their main crops were pulses, grains, pepper, fruit juices, tomato, tobacco, and cotton. Trade was carried on by the barter. Inca. The Inca Empire, which flourished during the 15th and 16th centuries, spread in the areas of Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Argentina. Other cultures existed before the Incas. The Inca Empire continued the old cultures. Since the Incas did not know writing, not much is known about their early life. They came and settled in Peruvian Zuco Valley around the 11th century and gradually occupied the whole valley. Information about their lives till the 15th century is vague. Tupac was a prominent leader of the Incas. He had fought the earlier tribe of Chimos and overpowered them. Over a period of time, his descendants worked to establish an empire. But in 1532, a Spanish army of only 200 men defeated the Incas. It murdered the Inca soldiers in a gruesome manner and took over the kingdom. The sun god was the most important deity of the Incas. They believed that god Viracocha was responsible for all creation. According to them, the sun god was the link between the people and god Viracocha. And this was the reason that there was a sun temple in all Inca centers. They worshipped objects of nature like the moon, the stars, and lightning, and prayed to other natural phenomena. The talent of the Incas can be seen more in their organizational ability than their artistic interest. Their empire had been divided into 4 provinces. Chiefs looked after the provinces. Above them was the king. Officials and priest can be seen to be powerful classes of the society here. The land was divided into three parts. One part was reserved for families.
Who has built an extraordinary video simulation that allows us to move through this space.
The difficulty is always twofold. First of all, that ancient city is now in ruins. So one problem we have is how do you go from the ruins to the way it did look in antiquity? Secondly, we only have random ruins. We don't have everything. So even if you could visualize what the Pantheon looked like or the Colosseum, they're a mile apart in the city. What was everything else? Most of it is missing. So the visualization is trying to put the whole city together.
And so let's take a look.
Okay.
It is just beautiful. We're now flying low over the city, over the Tiber.
It's a good place to start because, you know, the Tiber does divide Rome into two parts.
And I see in the distance a very large temple.
That's the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best and the greatest, which was the main temple of the Roman state cult. And it's on top of the Capitoline Hill, which because of this temple and some others was considered the center of the state cult and the state religion.
So what moment in Rome's history have you chosen?
This is notionally the year 320 AD, the peak of Rome's urban development, certainly in terms of public architecture, for the simple reason that the emperor at this time was Constantine the Great, and shortly after this year he moved the capital from Rome to his city of Constantinople. Okay, so we're flying up the river, and after the Capitoline Hill, we see the Palatine Hill, another one of the 7 canonical hills of Rome.
And the Palatine is obvious to anybody who visits Rome. If you're in the Forum, this is the great hill with the palaces.
In fact, the word palace derives from the word palatine. The Romans, as time went on in their history, said wherever the emperor is, there the palace is, or the Palatine. So the term palace got detached from this physical hill and came to just mean a place where the ruler lives.
And actually, as we're flying past what is the Circus Maximus, I see the Imperial Palace. This is so large, it has literally enveloped the entire hillside.
We have to remember this was not only where the emperor lived and his family with him, but it was also the center of government.
Any important relationship between this enormous circus and the palace?
They are in fact connected, and the emperor was a great giver of the circus games and could easily come down to the imperial box from the palace, or if he wanted, he could even watch the circus races from at the palace.
So we're not talking about Barnum and Bailey, we're talking about sporting events.
We're mainly talking about chariot races. Think Ben-Hur, the famous chariot race scenes. And there were also animal hunts, there were parades, religious processions, the triumphal procession.
So let's go into the city proper. We know that Rome was this mercantile culture that had real markets. How much do we know about the daily lives of the inhabitants?
We know a huge amount we know about their hundreds of trades and professions, the different social classes. We know about their diet. We know about their longevity. The scholars have really reconstructed in great detail what everyday life was like.
So one of the most impressive structures that I'm seeing is this aqueduct, this highway for water.
Yeah, the Romans are famous for their aqueducts. They never could have had the big city of 1 million or even 2 million that we're now seeing without the aqueducts. It brought water in from 20 or 30 miles away in the mountains. They kept this gravitational system working by getting the sources up in the mountains, bringing it down into the city in the valley, which gave the force to the water. And they were able to somehow calculate a slope of even just 1 foot every 2,000 feet, which is remarkable. We don't know how they could measure so accurately, so that the water kept moving gently downhill but relentlessly downhill.
There is this kind of ambition, this notion that man can control nature, does not need to build a city where the water is already, but one can actually bend nature to man's will.
The Romans were remarkable engineers. They used the water for drinking purposes, obviously cooking and so on, but also a lot of these aqueducts ended at great fountains, but also in the great public baths.
So this area seems to be sort of set apart from this denser urban part of the city. And these are the baths of Trajan.
Yes, these were not the first public baths, but they were the baths that gave the standard design for public baths. A block of bathing buildings in the middle of a kind of a garden area delimited by a wall.
And we were talking earlier about the way in which the emperors would provide for the well-being of the city, and this is really a prime example. So now we're moving to some of the most well-known monuments in ancient Rome, the Colosseum. But we're in a fairly late moment in Roman history. Before the Colosseum, wasn't there another palace here?
There was. The Colosseum was built by the Emperor Vespasian, who became emperor in 69 AD after the suicide of Nero, a very unpopular emperor. And one of the reasons he was so unpopular was that after the Great Fire of 64 AD, in which a lot of the city was destroyed, he took over 100 acres in the heart of the city and converted it from private property to his own personal use as a palace, the Golden House of Nero. And the Colosseum was actually a lake in that palace. And Vespasian, to show he was a friend of the people, filled in that lake and built the Colosseum on top of it.
The Colosseum was not originally called the Colosseum.
No, that's a term that only goes back to the early Middle Ages. The Romans called it the Flavian Amphitheater because Vespasian's family name was Flavius, so Flavian. And it's an amphitheater, or kind of a double theater, an oval in shape. The Romans certainly didn't call it Colosseum, but they did call this enormous statue the Colossus. It's a statue of the sun god.
Now, you had mentioned that this is the moment when Constantine rules Rome and has not yet moved the capital to the east. I think it's interesting to look at his arch, the Arch of Constantine, and realize that this is brand new.
It's only a couple of years old. Constantine left Rome after he defeated Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. As far as we know, he never came back to Rome to actually see it.
So we've just risen over the edge of the Colosseum. We're looking down.
This is, in a way, a mirror of Roman society. The best seats are the ones farthest down, closest to the arena, and that was reserved for the emperor, top office holders, priests, and so on. Then behind them were the senators, behind them the wealthy businessmen, and behind them the freeborn normal citizens. At the very top sat women, slaves, and foreigners.
So what were they coming to watch?
As we can see now, what's going on is the main thing that we associate with the Colosseum, the gladiatorial combats. Another thing that went on here that the Romans loved was hunts of wild animals. The third thing is the execution of criminals, often in very colorful ways that we would find very cruel.
So let's make a left turn and move towards the Forum. What is that enormous temple?
It's the biggest temple of the state religion. It's a temple of Venus and Rome. It was built by the Emperor Hadrian. It's actually interesting because it's two temples back to back. One part of it is dedicated to the worship of the goddess Venus. That's the one facing the Colosseum. The other to the goddess Roma. That's facing the Forum. And there seems to be a reason for that. Venus is looking at the Colosseum, which is associated with fun and games. Otium, the Romans would say, leisure. Whereas Roma is a more serious goddess. She's facing the Forum, which is the area of negotium, or business and work.
Okay, so now we're moving over to the Forum itself.
And we'll stop first at the Basilica of Maxentius, the last of the great civic buildings built in Rome before Constantine moved the capital.
This is a huge structure, and if the word basilica is familiar to us, we often call churches basilicas now.
For the Romans, it was a civic building used mainly for courts. The Christians adopted the building form because they worship inside. So they adopted this pre-existing building form and gave it a new content.
So now we're moving into one of the most complicated parts of Rome, and especially when you try to look at the ruins and understand how these buildings related to each other.
I always say the Forum is like the mall in Washington. It's a big open public space used for public events like parades and speeches. The buildings around that open space are also public, and they are courthouses and temples. Then on the Forum Plaza are, as in the case of the mall in Washington, monuments commemorating great men and important events. Adjacent to the Forum, private property was increasingly bought up so that each emperor could build his own forum, the so-called imperial, or fora of the emperors.
We've made a full circle, and we're now looking again at the Capitoline.
We're flying over the Roman Forum. We'll actually come back to it. We're flying over the Capitoline Hill. Now we can see the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. And we're going beyond, back toward the river, where we find a big flat area of Rome called the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars. It was called that because in the Roman Republic, when there was a citizen army, the army would meet here and train.
Now, we've just moved over this lovely squared pond, and we're looking at the flank of an enormously important building, the Pantheon.
The rotunda, the round part, we wouldn't really see in antiquity. We would see the part that has the 8 columns across the front that looks like a traditional temple. We like to say that it was built as a building with a surprise on the inside, because it does look like a regular Greek or Roman temple, but when you get inside, that's when you notice that there's actually the rotunda.
I just want to spend just a second marveling at the scale of this structure. Look at those columns. They are enormous. The ability to get stones that large upright is just a phenomenal feat in itself.
It's phenomenal, and even more so when you consider that this is granite and it's all from Egypt, so it was brought from very far away. This is a building that celebrates the Roman emperors. This building we know had statues of Julius Caesar and then Augustus, so we think that this building then was dedicated always to the worship of the emperors.
So this space opens up just magically.
It does, and the magic is really remarkable. I've taken many visitors there, and I've asked them if they have the same experience that I've had. If you stop right on the threshold and you hold your head straight, I always say, what can you see? And everybody always agrees. You can see the hole in the dome up at the top. We call it the eye. You can see the floor, and you can see the two sides left and right. That is to say, this is a grandiose space, but it's right at the limit of human vision. And for me, it always defines what is the classical, which is always derived from the human form, its proportions, and its limitations. And by building a building that exactly corresponds to the limits of our vision, it ennobles us. It makes us feel as big and great as we can feel as humans. It doesn't reduce us. Had it been 10 times bigger, we would have felt ourselves reduced to the size of an ant or something. The building is obsessively concerned with circular form, but it also is concerned with squares. If we look at the floor, we actually see this play of squares and circles.
And then, of course, there are the coffers that create this beautiful sense of rhythm.
Absolutely. And notice we also there get the play of squares and circles, because these are square coffers that give us a semicircular dome. But what's interesting to me about it is, first of all, it was painted. When you go there today, the paint has been completely lost, in the Dome of Heaven motif. So the ground of the dome is painted blue. The coffers are highlighted in yellow as if radiating the light of the sun. And in the middle were probably rosettes that are supposed to be suns or stars. And even in antiquity, we know from a historian who wrote only 100 years after the building was built, people wondered, how did they build the dome? How could they do that? They marveled at it even in antiquity. The light is very interesting. If you look at the coffering, you can get the idea that, you know, the light from the eye is going to direct the sunbeams to different coffers at different times of the day, different days of the year. Recent scholarship suggests that this wasn't really a sundial, but there was a play of the passage of time and the play of light on space to indicate the passage of time during the year. There is, though, one alignment that seems to be very intentional, and that is that the sunlight coming through the eye at noon on April 21st exactly illuminated the main doorway of the Pantheon. Remember, Hadrian was the man responsible for the Pantheon in this phase. April 21st was the birthday festival of Rome. Hadrian was very interested in the birthday festival, changed the name to the Romaya, festival in honor of the goddess Rome. He seems to have aligned the building in such a way that there would be this dramatic effect at noon. And we can only imagine there must have been some sort of birthday festival happening in the Pantheon that day.
So let's move back down to the Forum now.
Some of the main roads going through the city met here in the Forum. It's a place that the average Roman on an average day might well pass through.
As the camera pulls back and we can really see the full extent of this city, you really understand how complex, how advanced this ancient world was. How many buildings were here, do we think?
We have 2 censuses from the 4th century AD that suggest there were between 8,000 and 10,000 buildings here. We think the population might have been between 1 and 2 million. The total surface area was about 25 square kilometers, so it was the biggest city in the